few minutes late, and I'm having to do this on my computer this morning, and instead of using my phone, and well, I'm not used to doing it with a computer. Technology is not always my friend. So anyway, let's continue what we've been doing over the last several weeks. Excuse me just a second. So the last several weeks, with a second cup of coffee on Wednesday mornings, I've been looking at some of the different kinds of literature that we find in the Bible. In the New Testament, of course, there's gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we have a lot of epistles or letters, most of which were written by the Apostle Paul. And then there is this strange, bizarre animal known as apocalyptic literature, primarily the book of Revelation, plus a little bit in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some few places in the Old Testament. And then we flipped back to the beginning of the book, to the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, they're the prophets. I referred to them a couple of weeks ago. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, and Amos, and all those guys. And then last week I referred to the Torah, or the law, which is the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so today we have history. And yes, once upon a time I did get a master's degree in history, sheepskin on the wall to prove it. So history is always near and dear to my heart. I'm going to read a little bit of Old Testament history. This comes from 1 Kings. I'll begin with verse 21. Now Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city that the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite. And Judah did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins that they committed, more than all that their fathers had done. For they also built for themselves high places and pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there were also male cult prostitutes in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations that the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. I'm going to skip down a few verses to 29. Now the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. And Rehoboam slept with his fathers and is buried with his fathers in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and Abijam his son reigned in his place. So that is a passage from Old Testament history. So when we turn to the Old Testament, we find some books there that contain history. And at this point, the way that we as Christians sort of categorize books and the way our Jewish kin do diverge a bit. So in case you're not aware, our Jewish cousins divide the Old Testament into 3 broad groups. The Torah, it's the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And then they have the prophets and the writings. And the prophets, included in the prophets, are some of what we call history. So in the Hebrew canon, the Jewish canon, and by the way, the books are exactly the same. It is exactly the same. So if I'm preaching from the Old Testament, what I read would be no different than what might be read in a synagogue. So Hebrew canon, the Torah, and then the prophets, and included in the prophets are some things which are really history. So Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are called the former prophets, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are the major prophets, and then you have the book of the 12, the minor prophets. And then they also have a third part of their canon, the writings, and included in the writings are some things which we would consider to be history. So included in the writings are Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. So as we Christians look at the Old Testament, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah are all history. And these history books they in essence tell the story of God's relationship with his people from the entry into the promised land to the exile. That's what they do. They tell that story from the entrance into the promised land, the beginning of Joshua, to their exile, and ultimately to their return from exile. So let's take a step back. What is history? History is not a recording of everything that happens. That's impossible to do. I was listening to a history podcast one time, and they used this definition of history, which I really liked. They said that history was the recorded part of the remembered part of the observed part of what happened. All the events that have ever happened in the world, nobody knows all of that, but there are what are observed, and then there's what's remembered, what's recorded. So history is the recorded part of the remembered part of the observed part of what happened, the recorded part of the remembered part of the observed part of what happened. And so when we read Samuel and Kings, or Chronicles, we're reading a snippet, small descriptions of major events, small descriptions of kings. Now, I should mention that, what we read in the Old Testament isn't classical history in the academic sense. Classical history, the academic sense, normally gets traced back to the ancient Greek writers Herodotus and Thucydides. But still, when you read Kings or Samuel, Joshua, Judges, that is history. Now, one thing to mention, particularly when you read Samuel and Kings, is that those books of history are written with an angle. They're not written purely as an academic exercise. They're not written as an academic exercise. They are written to answer a question. And the question is this. So if you are an ancient Jew in Babylon, you look back over your history and you know, or at least you thought you knew, that you were the chosen people. God gave covenants with Abraham and Moses and then David. You're the chosen people, and now here you are. Your holy city is rubble, your temple is rubble, and you are in exile. And how does that happen? How does it happen that the chosen people, people that God had claimed, that had established covenants with, how do you go from that to being an outcast? And Samuel and Kings in particular are written to answer that question. And the answer that they came up with is a simple word called sin. And so those books are written to illustrate all of the guilt of the people through the years. And so when you pick up Kings, and so reigned in Israel for 18 years, and his mother's name was such and such, and he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he slept with his fathers, and so reigned in his place. Or in the case of what I read, Rehoboam reigned in Judah ever how many years? 22 years, I think. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, gave his mother's name, brief detail, and then he slept with his fathers, and his son Abijam reigned in his place. That same pattern over and over again, and each time so-and-so did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And only in like maybe 3 cases are kings recorded as having done what was right in the sight of the Lord. So over and over again, so-and-so did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And that's their answer. The answer in Kings and in Samuel to why this terrible thing has happened to us is just guilt. And eventually God sort of removed his protection from them and let the chips fall where they may. And if you want to get a good academic exercise sometime, is read about the description of a couple of kings from 1st or 2nd Kings, and the same characters in 1st or 2nd Samuel. Samuel is written, it's history as well, but it's written from a slightly different angle, and so things are recorded a little bit differently, again because they're written for different purposes. So again, these books of history, they tell us of the relationship between God and his people. And they are almost like a running commentary on the status of the covenant between God and his people. And in Samuel and Kings, for the most part, it's not a pretty picture. Chronicles is a slightly rosier. But in these books, from Joshua and Judges, Joshua where the people entered the promised land, and then after Joshua's death, the period of the Judges covered in the book of Judges, and then the establishment of the monarchy, and that's covered in Samuel and all the kings to the end of 2nd Kings, and then much of that same period in Samuel and Kings is covered in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then all the way to Ezra and Nehemiah, where the exiles return home. And they record the history of God's relationship with his people. And sometimes these books of history in the Bible are not the most scintillating of reading. 1st and 2nd Samuel can be tough sledding. But pick up some of these books of history sometime and read through them. In particular, read several chapters of first or 2nd Kings. And by the way, 1st and 2nd Kings was originally one book, just like Samuel and Chronicles. Ezra and Nehemiah originally one scroll as well. Pick up Kings and read several chapters and notice the pattern. so-and-so reigned in Judah ever how many years, his mother's name was such and such, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Maybe a little bit of explanation of all the evil that he did. He slept with his fathers, and his son reigned in his place. And then the son reigned however many years, his mother's name was such and such, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like his father David had done. And you see this pattern, So just pick up Kings sometime and read a little bit of it. And if you really are extra credit, read 2 or 3 chapters of Kings, and then read 2 or 3 chapters of Chronicles, covering the same period, and you can tell the different flavor, the different spin on things. So anyway, with that, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.